So straight off with a question from Chaffinch77. Hi, Bridget. It seems clear to me that many of the problems in our schools, from RAAC to lack of staff to lack of basic stationery, are problems that can only be solved by spending more money. But the Labour Party repeatedly stresses that they don't have big spending plans. And Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves keep talking about reform rather than investment. How can you reform your way out of crumbling buildings or of not having enough textbooks for kids? How do you actually solve these problems without spending money?
I completely recognise all of that in terms of the need for schools to be supported. I visit schools the length and breadth of the country, and I hear similar messages wherever I go. I think recruitment and retention of teachers is also a really big issue that we're seeing at the moment. What we have set out is that we would end the tax breaks that private schools enjoy. We put that money directly into state education and delivering more teachers into our classrooms, better mental health support for our children, and also greater support when children are first starting at school around speech and language development and in the early years as well. I mean, so many of the problems that we're seeing are around a longer term failure from the government to have a plan around education. If Labour win the next election, if I'm the Education Secretary, it's my job to make sure that education is front and centre, because I do believe it's just central to the ambition that we would have for our country and how we make our country fairer and more equal, and how we make sure that all children get the chance to thrive and get the chance to succeed. But there will be tough choices because the economy's in a total mess. We haven't seen growth in any meaningful way for years and years now, and that will mean it will take us time to deliver everything that we would want to do. And we won't be able to do all of those changes from day one. But in education, there's actually quite a lot I believe we could change that isn't just about spending more money, whether that's reform of Ofsted as one example. Some of the wider changes around curriculum I want to see in our schools, so all children having access to a broad and balanced curriculum that includes music and sport and much more besides. So where we've got plans to spend money, we're clear about how we're going to fund it. But alongside that, I believe there's a lot of change that we could make very quickly if we won the trust of the British people and formed that next government.
So in sort of response to that, you're sounding a bit like there won't be much difference in a year's time, because Potter in the Garden asks, what actual difference would we see in our schools in 1 year into a Labour government?
I believe that we need to reset the relationship altogether between government and education. I don't believe it's been given the priority it deserves. And certainly when I speak to parents, but also teachers, support staff, they're clear that a lot needs to change. So reset that relationship, make education central once more to the work of government. That would be immediate. We would do that straightforwardly. We're obviously working on what we say in our manifesto, but alongside that, we have to be absolutely ready to go from day one if we win that election. And we are planning for how we would make change happen if we're really fortunate enough to form that next government. So whether it's reform of Ofsted, we would raise money through ending tax breaks on private schools. We would do that quickly to put that into state schools. That would help us to deliver more teachers. That would allow us to deliver more mental health support. Also universal breakfast clubs in all of our primary schools. We would crack on with making that happen from day one. Of course, it would take time to roll some of this out, but we would see a rapid pace. We would want to make sure that that change that we need to see starts as quickly as possible, because some of these problems are deep rooted and it will take time to get it right. And the sooner we start, the sooner we can get there.
And you mentioned mental health funding in your first answer, and Teen Divided says, given how mental health has such an impact on school attendance, are Labour planning on significantly increasing funding for CAMS so our young people get the early intervention support they need?
What we've said as a first step is that we will deliver mental health hubs in communities, so there's open access that people can get support as quickly as possible, including young people, but also better mental health support within schools too. I know a lot of schools are having to invest some of their own budgets into making that happen because the demand is just so great around provision in school, around counselling and student welfare and much more besides. The commitment that we have is around a trained mental health counsellor in every secondary school. So as a first step to making sure that young people get support as quickly as possible. Around CAMS, the whole system, the waiting lists, the time it takes for referral to treatment is completely unacceptable. I mean, I'm working closely with my colleague Wes Street in the Shadow Health Secretary on how we seek to drive improvement around waiting times and earlier access to mental health. But given the scale of what we're facing, I have to be upfront about the fact it will take us time to reform that system. But it breaks my heart when I speak to young people and parents who desperately want and desperately need access to mental health provision, and it just isn't there, and it's damaging too many young lives.
It's kind of another one. Can it be done without significant increase in funding? And you know, what is the actual number you're planning to spend?
Labour governments always prioritise investment in our public services, our schools and our hospitals, and that was certainly the record of the last Labour government. And we were able to do that because we had a growing economy and we could invest that money through growth into public services. The situation that an incoming Labour government would face is more difficult than in 1997 because growth is negligible. That's why Rachel Reeves, our Shadow Chancellor, has said that our first priority has to be growing the economy. You know, if the economy had grown in the last 13 years, anything like it had done under the last Labour government, then we would have had more money to invest in our public services. But you know, what we've set out around mental health is a funded plan to deliver more support into schools, which teachers and support staff in schools tell me they really want to see happening too, because it, of course, it damages young people's life chances, but it also has obviously an impact on their ability to learn, and that's, you know, damaging on so many levels. So yes, there will be money that we have set out to go into that. Of course, there will be more that we will need to consider, but we have to get our economy growing.
Okay. And on retention, All Star Facilier says, I'm a teacher and I'm considering leaving due to how things are currently. We're battling poor behaviour. I'm verbally abused on a daily basis with no support other than being told to keep even the most difficult children in school. On top of this, we have insanely high targets and have lost faith in the exam system after this round of GCSEs being so poorly marked. Some of our exam papers went up by 2 grades when we requested remarks. What are your plans to retain teachers?
Sadly, I do hear that right across the country. I know that so many of our teachers feel really undervalued and underappreciated for the work that they're doing. I think we have to have a fundamental reset of that relationship between government and the profession. I think we need to value and recognise the professionalism of teachers. I don't feel the current government have been doing that, often using very dismissive and derogatory language in talking about people who've dedicated their lives to making sure that young children and young adults get a really great start. So we've set out commitments around more teachers into our classrooms. I know many teachers are having to cover classes in subjects, particularly at secondary level, where they don't have the level of expertise they would like. Schools are more dependent upon supply teachers. That has budget pressures alongside it. I think we also do need to look more carefully at some of the challenges that we're seeing about the need to deliver more flexible working opportunities into teaching. You know, we see a big drop off, particularly in the number of women in their 30s and 40s who are leaving teaching because they find they're just struggling to combine work with family life and home life. I think we need to have a conversation about that. And I want to work with the profession, work with trade unions representing teachers and support staff too, who've got a really important role to play in delivering better working conditions. And I hear those issues around behaviour and attendance wherever I go. Some of that, I believe, is linked to the pandemic, and we never had a proper plan from the government coming out of the pandemic to address some of those challenges that were already bubbling beneath the surface, but have become more pronounced coming out of the pandemic. And it was the now Prime Minister, the then Chancellor Rishi Sunak, who said that we'd maxed out on the support that would be available for our young people. I think that was completely negligent. And, you know, that is not the approach that we would have taken, but we are where we are now. And, you know, we'll need to focus, if we win the election, on delivering the support and the change that teachers and school support staff deserve. Yeah,
and obviously culture is important, but the kind of elephant in the room here again is pay. And Aisha 231 says, Bridget, what is your position on teachers' pay? Did you support calls for fully funded pay rises in line with inflation? Do you think we will continue to attract skilled professionals into teaching without an attractive pay reward?
It is obviously increasingly more of a challenge, not least because, you know, especially in some of the subjects where shortages are most acute, people have options in the private sector too, and see some of the balance they can sometimes strike around flexible working as well. I know that, you know, teaching is such an important, you know, such an incredibly important role, and we, all of us, remember the teachers that shaped and influenced our lives and the positive impact that they have. So I think, yes, it is partly about raising the status of the profession. I want to see teachers given more time for professional development and training. That's an issue that's raised time and again when I visit schools around the country. On pay, it's hard to look at the numbers where it comes to real terms pay cuts that teachers have suffered over the last 13 years and not recognise there's real deep dissatisfaction about the fact that it's a skilled professional job where they should be supported. I wouldn't be able to wave a magic wand and commit to a figure right now, but what I would have done would be to have a serious process of negotiation with the profession to reach something that we can all live with. We obviously got there in the end. The current Education Secretary finally resolved that dispute almost a year after it first took place, and that again caused further needless disruption to our children's education, and again part of that challenge around attendance too. So it's a process of negotiation. You seek to get to a position that where you can all agree. But the record of the last Labour government was real terms pay increases for teachers. I'd love to be able to deliver that again. The economic circumstances are tough, so I can't make that kind of commitment. And I wouldn't, I don't think it will be right to negotiate and look to a figure outside of that negotiating room. But I do want to make sure that we're delivering brilliant graduates into our classrooms and that people don't just come, but they stay as well. And that's why we've set out policy around retention payments for early careers teachers to recognise the additional work that they've put into their teacher training and their professionalism as a first step towards rebuilding that relationship with the profession and driving high standards in our schools, because the way that you get great outcomes for children is through brilliant teaching.
Thanks. And Mama Sass asks on the RAAC issue, will Labour provide funding for schools affected by RAAC and additional funding to support children who have had their education severely disrupted because of it? My son is at a school in Yorkshire with RAAC. He has gone back to a poor offer of online but not live learning, with no idea how long it will last or any clarity on whether the funds have been secured for temporary classrooms or a rebuild of the school. My son tells me it feels like he doesn't matter. Will he matter to you if Labour are in power?
Absolutely. And I visited a number of schools in England where they're affected in exactly the same way. And it is shocking and shameful that after all of the disruption of the pandemic, too many young people are going back to that kind of remote learning or a combination of the two, or even where it's face-to-face, it's being done in a community centre or within the lunch hall because the classrooms are out of action. What I've been really pushing for, and I've been pushing around this for months because I've been concerned about the condition of our schools estate, absolutely RAAC, but beyond that, asbestos, drainage issues, roofs that are falling in. There are thousands of schools in our country that have gone beyond their design life and should have long since been replaced. So I've been pushing the government on that point because we, until quite recently, didn't have the condition survey that the government had undertaken to try and establish the full scale of this. They resisted that, but we got there in the end. But we still actually don't have the full scale of what's going on around RAAC. So, in opposition, what we're trying to do is to push the government to establish the scale of the problem. It's hard to set out a plan for what happens next, given that the government are being far from transparent about the full extent of all of this. And my fear is that they hope that they can just kind of kick it beyond the election. It might become someone else's problem. I want to see mitigations put in place immediately, and whatever, the government had said that they'll do whatever is needed to fund schools to put in place those mitigations. I know that is still not happening in some cases, but alongside that, a plan to get RAAC out of schools and actually to rebuild the schools that are affected. The government have said that they have a plan for that. I've yet to see that plan, but then it's hard for me to identify, to set out an alternative position, given that we don't actually know the full extent of it. And, there's been a lot of secrecy from the government on this. And, sadly, it's children who are losing out. And, it's a desperate situation. And we're going to keep pushing on this. Had the government not cancelled Labour's school rebuilding programme when they first came in 2010, then we would be in a stronger position now.
Okay, thanks. And you mentioned at the beginning VAT on private schools, and we've had a few questions on that on Mumsnet. So here's one from If They'd Only Get a Shift On. Hi, Bridget, thanks for doing this. Regarding VAT on private school fees, what assumptions have been made in the 1.7 billion saved calculation? for what proportion of private school pupils will be pushed into state education? And has the cost of this on the state been factored into that 1.7 billion?
Yes, it has. And if you looked, we've looked to the report from the Independent Institute for Fiscal Studies, who looked at how much ending the tax breaks could raise, and then looked at what might happen if students were to leave the private sector. So they considered all of that, and their conclusion was that net the policy and the shift would raise 1.3 to 1.5 billion pounds a year in revenue. So I think that's an independent costing from a respected independent organisation, and we're using that as the basis for our work. That's a lot of money, and that would allow us to deliver 6,500 new teachers, better mental health support in our schools, more support around teacher training and development, greater support around early years too, so more effective speech and language interventions when children are starting at primary school. I just think it's a simple question of political priorities. I don't think the tax breaks private schools enjoy can be justified, and the independent evidence is absolutely clear about how much we could raise and how we could then choose to use that money differently.
But as I'm a Sucker says, do you think the state education system is ready for the potential influx of 90,000 students from the private sector who can't afford the 20% fee increase proposed by Labour?
Well, I don't recognise that number. I think that's a number that the private schools lobby use, and it's certainly not a number that the IFS...
What do you think the right number is, Bridget?
Well, the IFS have estimated, have done a couple of estimates, but much, much lower than that. But actually, alongside that, we're seeing demographic shift across our schools. We're in a position now where, many people know that schools in their community are reducing their roles or taking out classes, or in some cases, schools are closing because that kind of demographic change that we had earlier on around the turn of the century is now kind of feeding through. So there is ample space. I don't recognise, that same challenge, and private schools, I think could well see are not required to pass on VAT to parents, and I think could choose to make different choices themselves about how they offer different kinds of provision. Everyone in recent years has had to make cutbacks. Many of the people that are taking part in this discussion will be facing difficult choices every day about what they can and can't afford in the middle of a cost of living crisis. And I think private schools are no different, and perhaps they should reflect on where they could be making savings too.
Thanks. And just on this issue of charitable status, which I think there's perhaps a bit of confusion about, Lime, Basil and Mandarin says, hi Bridget, you previously said that charitable status for most private schools is something that should come to an end. Do you still believe that?
I've always been focused on how we end the tax breaks and how we then use that money to deliver high standards in our state schools, and ending charitable status was not a necessary part of doing that. We can press ahead with ending the tax breaks relatively quickly and then put that money into delivering better outcomes for children. So the policy is unchanged in that regard.
So Labour is not going to remove charitable status for private schools?
It's not necessary to raise the money that we want to raise through the tax breaks that we could then put into state education, which is where, of course, the vast majority of children in our country will go to school.
Great, thanks. So moving on to childcare, obviously a few questions on childcare, it being Mumsnet. Celsi Wilhelmina says, when will we have more detail on what Labour will do on childcare? I was really pleased when you previously hinted at universal provision and wholesale reform, but things seem to have gone pretty quiet recently.
It's reforming childcare and the early years system overall is a really big priority for me. I mean, it's how you deliver better outcomes for children. It's the evidence is clear that support in the early years makes the biggest impact kind of coming through schools and young people's lives. But I also know and recognise the pressures that lots of families are under right now, particularly women. Whether it's not always fair, but that's just a fact that it's often women that end up feeling the consequences of a childcare system that isn't providing what they need and forces very difficult choices around work and the number of hours that women in particular can work in the kinds of jobs that they choose. So there's an economic argument. There's also an argument about children's life chances, and I think the government slightly lost sight of that. And I believe strongly in the need to kind of drive up standards in the early years and childcare sector and provide greater quality and greater support so that children are arriving at school. The change that I was talking about was also about how we better integrate early years into the education system overall. So many countries recognise that early years should be part of the wider education system and recognised as such in a way that we just don't have in this country, where there is an unnecessary separation. We will be saying more as part of our manifesto. We've got a Labour Party conference coming up, so we'll be talking more about our plans around education there as well. But it absolutely remains a key part of what I'm committed to delivering. You'll know that as the first step towards that, I set out Labour's plans for universal breakfast clubs in all primary schools. So recognising that parents' childcare needs aren't just about the early years, important though they are, but about around the school day as well, and the pressures that many parents will experience around drop-off and pick-up. So delivering breakfast clubs in all our primary schools would be a first step, and I think would really help. But alongside that, again, the independent evidence is clear that it provides children not just with a good start to the day, but delivers better academic outcomes too, and supports issues around behaviour and attendance too, giving children that softer start. So the government announced, in the budget, additional money to go into the system. My worry is that without a plan for reform alongside it, particularly around the workforce and how we get and support more people into the sector with good terms and conditions and good progression, parents are going to feel badly let down when that doesn't materialise. But they've put more money in, and that does provide different options about how you choose to reform a system. And I want to move away from the hours-based approach that we've got at the moment, because I just don't believe it's working. Right.
So as New Mum 0305 says, are you planning to reverse the changes to childcare ratios?
I wouldn't have brought them in, and I don't support the changes. That was almost universal across the sector as well, that many providers have said that they won't be going ahead with those changes. I'd want to look and see where we had got to and whether those changes had really taken effect. But alongside that, to review the system overall, because there's a real pressure around, we talk about recruitment and retention in schools. The pressures in our early years sector are really acute, and increasingly, including in the maintained nurseries, will tell me that they're losing staff to retail and to other jobs because it's just not valued and recognised. So there's a lot overall that will need to change, and considering ratios as a part of that wider reform is necessary. But we wouldn't have done that. I don't believe it's what parents want or what children need, or certainly what many in the sector will be delivering in any event.
Right, so it's likely to go. It's what I'm taking from that. Sam says 345. She says, hi Bridget, what do you think about rebranding childcare as early education? Always seems crazy to me that during some of the most formative years of a child's life, we don't prioritise making sure they're given the developmental guidance and education they need to flourish. We pay the people who work in the sector a pittance, give them no real status, but not getting right for kids, especially those from more disadvantaged backgrounds during those years, causes major problems in later years. So what about rebranding?
I recognise that frustration. I hear it a lot. I mean, particularly for younger children, it can sometimes be that balance of care and early education that obviously shifts as children become toddlers and the focus becomes more on some of those developmental goals. I do think we need to recognise the professionalism and the expertise of people working in the sector, but I actually want them to be better supported for what they're doing, and I want them to have a voice and have greater status too. I think the risk of getting slightly bogged down in the language is parents will often talk about childcare, and I think it's important we meet people where they are. There is a really important aspect around early education. I try to talk about the two because some parents just won't speak in the language of early education, important though that is, and I think for me, it's more important about seeking to try and understand what needs to change as a part of that. But yes, I do recognise around the issues around status and progression and the sector overall, and that is a real challenge.
Okay, thanks. Now, moving on to sex and gender and the way that's being taught in schools. Arabella Scott says, hi Bridget, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the teaching and implementation of gender ideology in schools, particularly given the Conservatives' failure to clarify the guidance.
Yeah, so as Arabella says, the government are currently consulting on this. I think it's right that they keep areas of policy under review. I think where parents have concerns about what's being taught within their child's schools, then they absolutely should have access to material. They should be able to raise those concerns. I'm speaking personally, my children's schools have always communicated very effectively what they're teaching ahead of time. They've shared with us materials. They've told us what that will be about. I recognise it can be a difficult issue for schools. Schools are seeking to navigate what can be some tricky territory sometimes, but I think it's about primarily with sex and relationships education, children understanding, yes, the basic concepts, but also understanding issues in an age appropriate way around relationships, around consent, around our place in the world, around the changes that young people experience as they go through puberty and onwards. I mean, that's what's most important. And I do find it frustrating that rather than seeking to navigate this in a way that's responsible, recognising the importance of sex and relationships education and the importance of children's well-being, the government increasingly is seeking to prioritise making it a headline grabbing issue, when I think we just need to take a step back and make sure that where there is guidance in place, it's working for schools, parents feel involved, but that young people do have access to high quality sex and relationships education. I think that was a welcome and important change.
Yeah, but I guess there is, it's not just the government making a mountain out of a molehill, because there is a lot of concern about the teaching of gender identity in schools. As Bonfire Lady says, hi Bridget, lots of children are currently still learning, whether in PHSE or within individual subjects, that everyone has a gender identity and it's possible to choose which gender you'd like to be when you grow up. Where schools enable social transition to experiment with these feelings, e.g. changing pronouns or to an opposite sex name, this forces the other children to accept a belief that they may not hold, and it risks locking the transitioned child onto a pathway of medicalisation for life and irreversible changes to their bodies. And that's obviously covered in the CAS review. What would Labour government do to balance the teaching of the two different beliefs of gender identity and sex immutability?
These are difficult issues that involve navigating what can be quite complex territory. I think my starting point, if I was Secretary of State, would be around young people's well-being. I think that just gets lost too often in the discussion. The government have said that they're consulting around guidance for schools on a range of issues, what you've just described there, but also alongside that, the questions that school leaders have been asking quite reasonably about how they balance their responsibilities, for example, where it might apply to single sex provision, whether that's, changing facilities, overnight accommodation, and also how the role for teachers, particularly alongside parents, in supporting young people who are experiencing issues around their well-being or experiencing distress. I mean, that can apply in the case of young people who are questioning their identity, but of course speaks to a much wider issue that we're facing at the moment around young people's well-being and their mental health too. It looks to me like the government might not conclude that process this side of the election. It's all gone rather quiet. And that would, any guidance would be subject to consultation if that were to be published. I do think we need guidance and clarity on it. I do hear that from school leaders. If we were elected, we would have to start that process over, in effect. So we'd have to start that process of working through the challenges that we see, but what need the balance and the balances that we need to strike, and then consult on that to get it right. I genuinely don't believe the way that we can do that effectively, balancing those challenges, recognising the concern, but also making sure that young people's well-being is properly supported and protected. I don't believe we do that by having loud and noisy conversations on the front page of national newspapers. So I'd want to take a step back, balance that, make sure that we do have an open discussion about the challenges that young people can experience growing up. It is, for young women in particular, I remember it myself. It's tough. It's a tough time growing up as a teenager, going through changes, and I am worried, for example, about the drop-off in young women's sport, and when they reach their teenagers, they're not taking part in sport and physical activity. That has impacts, their whole life long. It's really important to lay those foundations for the rest of your life, and therefore, discussions about changing facilities and so on do have to take account of that too. But I know that schools are trying to navigate this right now, making sure that, for example, in the case of changing facilities, that they're making sure that all young people can feel safe and respected at school. And I think, you know, our position more widely on this area of policy is that I want, you know, trans people throughout their lives to be supported and free from discrimination. But alongside that, we do need to make sure that there are single-sex spaces. I used to manage a women's refuge. You know, I recognise the trauma that women who've experienced sexual violence and domestic abuse continue to go through, and it's clear that's why there was provision in the law to ensure that single-sex provision could be put in place where that's necessary.
Okay, thanks. So Last Train to London says, currently the government fines hardworking parents who take their kids out of school for a week's holiday, often due to the unaffordable prices or the fact that not everyone is lucky enough to work a regular office-type job where holiday can be taken at convenient times. Surely in cases where the child has otherwise excellent attendance, creating an adversarial system of fines and punishments isn't either in the spirit of encouraging partnership with parents overschooling or productive in sending the right message. I note the current laws also strip head teachers of the ability to use their judgment or discretion in all but the most extreme cases. Is there a better middle ground available here, which also supports hardworking parents? What's your position on this?
I do recognise that the costs of holidays go up massively, you know, during school holidays, and you know, and given the cost of living crisis, families quite rightly want to spend time together and want to take a holiday. However, you know, attendance at school, being at school with children, does really, really matter, and the figures that we're seeing at the moment around school attendance and especially persistent non-attendance from a significant minority of children is a real concern, and I do think has to be a focus for government. I'm not convinced that levelling fines in those circumstances is the right way to go. I don't believe it's necessarily the most effective way that you support families. Often children can be struggling to get to school for a range of different reasons, but I'm afraid I do believe that being at school regularly does matter, and that parents should be seeking to take holidays outside of term time. I think there is more that we could look to do with the industry around how we manage some of this. And I know some schools sometimes will stagger school holidays, or will have slightly different term dates to try and make it a bit easier for parents. But the problem that we're seeing at the moment around school attendance, I'm afraid, just means that a focus on getting children to be at school regularly has to be the priority.
Yeah, and if not fines, then how do you go about that?
You know, I'm not saying that there will be circumstances in which you know, fines are necessary, but I think just looking to increase fines or to levy more fines isn't going to deal with some of the more entrenched issues that we're seeing. You know, whether it's young people's mental health issue, you know, some issues around children who have special educational needs and disabilities where they're out of school, cost of living crisis. I hear increasingly that sometimes older siblings are being asked to stay at home to look after younger siblings because parents are struggling or because they're having to work. Schools will be doing what they can to support families, and you know, increasing cases of anxiety and mental health concerns around young people are sometimes a barrier to that as well. So again, having timely access to mental health support, I think, is really, really important alongside that too.
Okay. And on special educational needs, Teeny Bop says, hi, Bridget, I'm sure you're aware about the national crisis concerning the lack of special school places and consequently the number of children who are either not receiving an education at all or one that doesn't meet their needs. How do Labour plan to tackle this issue?
I mean, the whole system, I know when I speak to parents across the country, has become increasingly adversarial, means that parents and children are not getting the support that should be their right, but also alongside that, schools are often under a lot of pressure in trying to support children with complex needs, especially within mainstream settings. I think there's more that we need to do to support staff within schools, within mainstream schools, around training and development. They tell me they regard that as being really important. I think early identification of special educational needs and disabilities is really important as well. So one of the plans that we've set out is around additional speech and language support when children are starting at school, a kind of a very effective intervention that's been identified that will allow for us to identify children who are who may have additional needs at a much earlier point. But the system overall, the government announced some reforms. That's happening rather slowly. So I would want those, the changes that can happen in the short term to take place to deal with some of those pressures around specialist places, but also some of the changes within the system to make it more effective, so parents don't have to wait months and months on end to have their case, and often, to get to the, in some cases, to get to an education, health and care plan. I am concerned that the government appear to be setting arbitrary targets around reducing those EHCPs, contrary to what they'd previously said. But I think the system as it currently stands is adversarial. There's too much pressure there, and it will require reform overall. But I think anyone who has worked through the system as a parent or has been through the system more recently in the education sector will recognise that some of that change will take time, and I think there are challenges and more that needs to happen as well within some of our mainstream settings around inclusion too.
Yeah, and Travelling Spoon says, I'd like to know how you would hold local authorities to account that break the law with regard to the EHCP process, going months over the mandatory timeframe that the law allows. What plans do you have there?
I mean, the system in many cases is just broken down, and I hear that a lot. I hear that as an MP, as a constituency MP, as well as a shadow Secretary of State, that it takes a long time. That I think that the challenge is around how some of the funding is delivered and how that is made to happen. So we will need to review all of that. But I understand the frustrations. I know the impact it has on lots of families and children in particular. And it is a broken system that the government have not prioritised fixing. It means that if we win the election, it doesn't look like much change will have happened in the short term. But I am absolutely determined that all children have the opportunity to thrive, and that includes children with complex needs or with additional needs, and making sure they have every opportunity in life, where at the moment it feels very, very difficult.
Okay, thank you. Now, a couple of questions on faith schools. Would Labour plan to stop the creation of new schools that select by religion? I'm fervently in favour of religious freedom of expression, but do not understand why segregating children by religion is desirable.
So I went to a Catholic secondary school myself. I think faith schools are an important part of the system that, parents value faith schools. They value mainstream schools as well, and much more besides. I don't think the priority, really, given the demographic shift that we're seeing at the moment, will be around opening up more provision. We're likely to see the contraction of places and provision in the years to come. But faith schools are an important part of the schools landscape, and that would continue under Labour.
Okay, thanks. And on school places, MKG Mum says, every school in our borough is oversubscribed. Some children are being sent to schools much too far away from home. Would Labour have any realistic plans to tackle this issue, and if so, how?
Part of the problem that we have at the minute is the lack of coordination, and especially the role for local authorities in being involved in some of that place planning. That's going to become more acute when we see some of those demographic changes that we've been talking about. So I want to look again at the role for local authorities in trying to coordinate some of that to make it a better process overall, because there have been examples where in some cases one school might be closing, yet another school would be expanding its capacity. There isn't currently a way of managing that process effectively. That does need to change. And I think we need to look again at the role for local councils and how we manage some of that. With the changes we've seen in recent years, we've ended up with a fragmented system. Okay,
thanks. And I think one sort of getting towards the end, but a kind of philosophical question for you from Much a Lover. A fundamental issue with the provision of education is the influence of political ideology by governments. Ministers with no background in education make sweeping changes based on personal agendas. Could education be run by the educators who prioritise learning over moulding children into workers? And are you going to be one of those ministers that comes in and makes sweeping changes based on your personal agendas, or will you listen to teachers?
Well, I won't be getting out my red pen like some Conservative ministers to impose my pet my kind of pet projects in that sense. Some of it becomes far too bogged down in the micro detail of it, and I think ministers have lost sight of the bigger picture. I do want to see a review of curriculum and assessment. That's why Labour's committed to an expert review for government of that. But that has to be led and informed by best practice here and from around the world, and also drawing on the expertise of people working in the sector. Now, Secretaries of State, when they're coming in, as politicians, it's their job to set a direction and to set out the changes they believe are best for the country. Now, that would apply right across the board, Labour or Conservative. But I'm not a teacher, and I don't have an education background. I do want to listen to the profession in delivering that. We might not always agree, but I think we should have frank and open discussion about what we believe needs to change, but work on the basis of kind of mutual respect and mutual understanding. I don't feel we've been in that position now for quite a few years, and we've had countless education secretaries in that period, and education just hasn't been a priority. So where we make change, I want to make sure it's done carefully and properly with due consideration, not rushing ahead, but also looking to what young people need both now and into the future. I think a big challenge that we will face is just about having the right staff in the sector overall, both in terms of support staff, who I believe deserve a much bigger voice. That's why I've committed to bringing back the school support staff negotiating body to give school support staff a stronger role within our system and a louder voice than they have at the moment. Our teaching assistants, our caretakers, everyone working to support our schools. But alongside that, I think teachers need to be valued for what they're doing, and I think that needs to be the first starting point. Education is, the way in which you can transform lives, and such an important means by which we break down those barriers to opportunity that too many of our young people still face. And early years in particular will be a focus for me, because that is where we will make a really big impact. But yes, absolutely working with people across the sector to deliver the change I think that so many of us really want to see and want to make sure that our children get a great start in life.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, we're going to draw a close there. I think we've asked you before. I think you're one of those rare people we've asked the biscuit question to, and you've said you don't really like biscuits. Although I have to say there's quite a high proportion of Labour people who seem to not like biscuits. But are you prepared to update that answer, or is it still your position that not really keen a biscuit fan?
If there was a biscuit on the table, I'd probably struggle to resist eating it. But if I went to the kitchen now and had to choose, I'd probably go for a bag of crisps, if I'm honest.
Great.
Sorry, so I'm just not really. I don't think I've even got any biscuits in the cupboard. I'm just not a biscuit person.
Okay, no worries. Each to their own. Thank you so much, Bridget, for all your time and very thorough answers. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and good luck at conference.
Thanks very much. Really grateful for the opportunity. See you later.
Cheers.